What would you do if the most feared alpha king in the realm was bleeding to death in your hayloft, and his own heavily armed search party was right outside your door? For a starving orphan girl with nothing to her name, the choice should have been easy. Hand him over, claim the massive reward, and never go hungry again. But as the towering commander steps closer, demanding to know if she's seen the wounded king, she doesn't point to the pile of straw. Instead, she looks him dead in the eye and tells a lie that will change the fate of the entire kingdom. The thunder of hooves woke her before the rooster did. Clara sat up in her thin cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the village road trembled under the weight of galloping horses. Many horses, moving fast with the jangle of metal and the harsh shouts of men. She pressed herself against the cold wall of the hut and held her breath. They passed. The sound faded toward the forest edge, but Clara did not move until the silence came back, thick and heavy as the frost on the window. She knew those hoofbeats. They meant trouble. Hugh was already at the workbench when she crept into the main room, splitting a plank with a dull thud. He did not look up. He never looked up in the morning. His hands were stained with wood sap and last night's wine, and the air around him smelled of sour ale and sawdust. "Get the water," he said. That was all. Clara nodded, though he was not watching, and pulled her shawl over her thin shoulders. The wool was patched in 3 places, and the wind bit through it like teeth. She crossed the muddy yard to the well, her bare feet numb against the cold ground. That was when she saw the trail. Drops of dark red leading from the edge of the woods toward the old barn at the far end of the field. Fresh, still wet. She stopped, the bucket in her hands forgotten, and stared at the splashes of blood in the frost. Her first thought was to run back to the hut and tell Hugh. Her second thought was that Hugh would tell her to mind her own business, and then he would drink more, and nothing would change. So she walked toward the barn instead. The door was unlatched. She pushed it open, and the smell of dry hay and old dust filled her nose. Inside was dim, with only a few slivers of gray morning light slipping through the cracks between the boards. She took a step, then another. The pile of hay in the far corner shifted. A voice, rough as gravel, came from the dark. "Don't scream." Clara froze. She could see him now. A man, half buried in the straw, his face pale and streaked with dirt and dried blood. His clothes were torn, fine fabric beneath the mud, and one hand was pressed hard against his side. The hand was huge, the fingers long and covered in old scars. Blood soaked through the cloth between them. He was not much older than the farmhands she saw at market, but there was something in his eyes that did not belong to a farmer. Something sharp, something that had seen things. "I won't hurt you," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word, and she saw the pain twist his face. Clara should have screamed. She should have run back to the village and told the men there was a stranger bleeding in the barn. That was what a sensible girl would do. But she had never been sensible. She crouched down, her knees almost touching the hay, and looked at the dark stain spreading across his side. You're hurt," she whispered. He stared at her, as if waiting for her to turn and run. She did not. "I'll get water," she said, and she was already backing away, her small hands trembling. "I'll be quiet, I promise." She did not wait for his answer. The hoofbeats were coming back. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Clara froze behind the barn wall, the bucket of water trembling in her hands. She could hear the jingle of harnesses, the snort of horses, and a man's voice, deep and impatient, calling out orders. "Search the outbuildings, every one of them." Her heart lurched. She pressed up against the rough wood, barely breathing. The barn was the first building they would check. The man in the hay, she had promised him water. She had promised to be quiet. But if they found him, they would take him. And from the look of his wounds, she did not think he would survive another journey. The footsteps came closer, a soldier's boots, heavy and sure, crunching on the frozen mud. Clara did not think. She dropped the bucket, slid around the corner, and darted into the barn through the back gap in the wall. the one where the boards had rotted away and no one had bothered to mend them. She fell to her knees beside the hay pile, her small hands shaking. "They're coming," she whispered. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." There was no answer. For a moment she thought he had bled out, that she had been speaking to a dead man. But then she heard his breath, shallow, ragged. But there. She grabbed handfuls of hay and threw them over him, covering the dark stain on his shirt, covering his face, covering everything until he was just another lump in the pile. Then she sat on top of it, her thin legs crossed, her hands clasped in her lap, and tried to look like a child who had nothing to hide. The door creaked open. A soldier stepped in, tall and broad, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He scanned the barn with quick-practiced eyes, the empty stalls, the broken plow, the sacks of feed. His gaze landed on Clara. "You girl, have you seen a stranger come through here? A man, wounded, wearing a dark cloak?" Clara shook her head. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She nodded instead, her chin trembling. The soldier took a step closer. "Are you sure? If you're lying—" "She's just a child, Garrett." Another soldier appeared in the doorway, older, with gray in his beard. "Leave her be. The trail when it called 1/2 mile past the creek. He's not here." The first soldier frowned but turned away. The door swung shut and the hoofbeats faded down the lane. Clara sat very still, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She waited until the sound was gone completely, until the silence of the barn settled back around her like an old blanket. Then she scrambled off the hay pile and began digging. The man's face emerged first, pale, slick with sweat, his eyes closed. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand, the way her mother used to do when she was sick. It was burning. "I'll get water," she said again, but this time she did not run. She crawled out, retrieved the bucket from where she had dropped it, and came back. She dipped a corner of her apron into the water and pressed it gently to his lips. He did not open his eyes, but his mouth parted, and he drank. She stayed like that for a long time, dipping and pressing, until the water was gone and his breathing had steadied. She did not know his name. She did not know why men with swords were hunting him, but she knew one thing that no one had ever taught her. When something was hurt, you did not walk away. She pulled the hay back over him, leaving only a small gap near his face so he could breathe. Then she sat beside him, her back against the wall, and watched the light fade through the cracks in the boards. When she finally slipped back to the cottage, Hugh was sitting at the table, a half-empty jug in his hand. "Took you long enough," he muttered. I spilled the water," she said. "I had to fetch more." He grunted and did not look at her. She was grateful for that. She did not think she could lie to his face and keep her voice steady. That night she lay on her pallet and stared at the ceiling, listening to Hugh's snores. The man in the barn had called her kind. No one had ever called her that before. She wondered if she would see him alive in the morning. Clara woke before dawn. The cottage was cold and dark, and Hugh's snoring filled the single room like the rumble of a distant storm. She dressed in the dark, pulling her worn woolen dress over her head, and crept to the kitchen corner. The loaf of black bread sat on the shelf. Hugh had bought it 3 days ago, and it was already hard and dry. She knew he would notice if she took the whole thing, so she broke off a piece, no bigger than her fist, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Then she slipped out the door before the first rooster crowed. The air was cold and sharp against her cheeks. Frost covered the dead grass in the yard, and her bare feet left dark prints on the path to the barn. She had no shoes. She had not had shoes since her mother died. She pushed the barn door open slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges. Inside, the smell of dry hay and old dust filled her nose. She stood still for a moment, listening. She heard his breathing before she saw him, shallow, uneven, but there. He was alive. She crawled into the hollow she had made in the haystack. The man lay on his back, His face turned toward the crack in the wall where the first gray light of morning was seeping through. His eyes were closed. His skin looked pale, almost waxy in the dim light. She reached out and touched his forehead with the back of her hand, the way her mother used to do for her when she was sick. He was still warm, too warm, but not as hot as the night before. Maybe the fever was loosening its grip. His eyes fluttered open. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. For a long moment, he just looked at her. His gaze was heavy, clouded with pain, but there was something else in it, a sharpness, like a blade hidden under water. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough, barely a whisper. She swallowed. I brought something." She pulled the piece of bread from her apron pocket and held it out to him. Her hand was trembling, and she hated herself for it. He looked at the bread, then at her face. His expression did not change. "I don't need charity," he said. It's not charity." She pushed the bread closer. "You have to eat. If you don't eat, you won't get better." He closed his eyes. She thought he was dismissing her, sending her away. But then he let out a long, slow breath, the kind of breath that hurt, that cost something. "Why do you care?" Hugh asked, without opening his eyes. The question caught her off guard. She had not thought about why. She had only thought about the bread, and the fever, and the fact that he was alive, and she wanted him to stay that way. "Because you're hurt," she said, and no one should be hurt alone." He opened his eyes again. There was a long silence, broken only by the creak of the old wooden walls and the distant call of a crow. Then he reached out. His hand was so much larger than hers, the knuckles bruised and swollen. He took the bread from her palm, his fingers brushing against her skin. "What's your name, child?" "Clara." He did not give his own. He just looked at the bread in his hand, then back at her, and then, slowly, he lifted it to his mouth and took a bite. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, like a small fire catching. She did not smile. She was too afraid to smile, afraid it would break the spell. But she sat back against the hay and watched him eat, piece by piece, until the bread was gone. When he finished, he looked at her again. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, almost reluctant, as if he was not used to saying them. "I'll bring more tonight," she whispered. "I promise." She crawled out of the haystack and slipped out of the barn, her heart beating fast and light. She did not know who he was. She did not know why armed men were looking for him, but she knew one thing: when she had offered him the bread, he had taken it. And that felt like a beginning. Clara kept her promise. That evening, after Hugh had finished his ale and fallen asleep by the fire, she crept back into the kitchen and wrapped 2 pieces of dark bread in her apron. She also found a small clay pot of honey, only a finger's worth at the bottom, and tucked it into her pocket. Her heart pounded as she slipped out the door, but the night was quiet and the stars were out. The barn was dark when she crawled inside. She whispered into the haystack, "I'm here." There was a rustle, then a low grunt. She pushed the bread and the honey pot toward the gap in the straw. "I brought honey, too. It's not much, but it's sweet." A hand emerged from the hay, still bruised but steadier than before, and took the bread. She heard him eat, slowly, chewing each bite as if it cost him something. Then the hand reached for the honey pot. There was a pause, then a soft sound that might have been a surprised grunt. He dipped a finger into the pot and brought it to his mouth. "It's good," he said, his voice rough but not as weak as before. Clara hugged her knees. "It's from the village market. The beekeeper's wife gives me the leftover scrapings sometimes. She says I'm too skinny." The man did not answer, but she heard him take another fingerful of honey. She was about to tell him about the beekeeper's cat when a sharp bark cut through the night. Clara froze. It was the limping dog, the one with the crooked leg that followed her sometimes. He must have caught her scent and followed her to the barn. "No, no, no," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. She crawled to the barn door and peered out. The dog stood a few paces away, tail wagging, one ear flopped sideways. He barked again, a cheerful, unafraid sound that seemed far too loud in the darkness. Shh, Clara hissed, waving her hands. Go away, go. The dog wagged his tail harder and took a step closer. From inside the haystack, she heard a sound she did not recognize at first, a low, rasping noise, like air escaping a cracked bellows. She turned. The man had shifted in the hay, and his face was visible now in the faint moonlight coming through a crack in the wall. His eyes were closed, but the corners of his mouth were turned up. He was laughing. Not a full laugh, more like a broken chuckle, rough and unpracticed, as if the muscles of his face had forgotten how to shape it. Clara stared. You're laughing. He opened his eyes. They were dark, but in the dim light they caught a flicker of something soft. That dog, he said, shaking his head. He has no sense of danger. He's stupid, Clara said. But she was smiling now, too. He got kicked by a horse last spring and hasn't learned a thing since. The man let out another quiet huff of air that might have been a laugh. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and his expression shifted. The laughter faded, but the softness remained. You're not afraid of him, he said. He's just a dog, Clara said. No, the man said slowly. You're not afraid of anything, are you? Clara looked down at her bare feet. I'm afraid of lots of things. Name one. She bit her lip. I'm afraid Hugh will find out I'm feeding you. I'm afraid we get worse and I won't know how to help. I'm afraid... She paused. I'm afraid you'll leave before you're ready. The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, I'm not ready yet. The dog barked again, closer this time. Clara turned and shooed him with both hands. Go home, go! The dog whined, then trotted off into the darkness, his crooked leg leaving a lopsided trail in the dirt. When she turned back, the man had closed his eyes again, but the honey pot was empty and the bread was gone. She felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the night air. She sat down by the haystack, her back against the straw, and listened to his breathing. It was deeper now, more even. She did not know his name. She did not know why armed men had come looking for him. But she knew in that quiet moment that she would keep bringing him bread and honey. She would keep guarding the door. And she would remember the sound of his laugh, rough and broken and real, for a long, long time. The next afternoon, Hugh found her by the pantry door with a half-eaten heel of bread in her hands. His eyes narrowed. You've been stealing food, doll. Clara froze. The bread felt like a stone in her fingers. I was hungry. Hungry? He snorted, taking the bread from her hand. You've been hungry for 3 days straight. The honey jar's nearly empty. You think I don't count what's mine? Her throat tightened. She wanted to explain, but the words tangled into silence. Hugh sighed, rubbing his temple. If I catch you again, you'll sleep in the barn with the rats, understand? She nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. He turned away, muttering about ungrateful mouths to feed. Clara waited until his footsteps faded, then slipped out the back door, her heart pounding. That night, she brought no bread, only water, and a small bundle of dried mint she had hidden under her mattress. The barn was dark when she crept inside, the straw rustling beneath her bare feet. I'm sorry, she whispered, kneeling beside the haystack. I couldn't bring anything tonight. Hugh almost caught me. There was no answer. She reached into the straw, her fingers finding his arm. It was hot, too hot. She pulled her hand back as if burned. Sir! Sir, can you hear me? A low groan came from the darkness, then a rasping breath, uneven and shallow. Clara's stomach dropped. She fumbled for the small lantern she had hidden behind a beam, lit it with trembling hands, and held it over him. His face was flushed, slick with sweat. His lips were cracked, and his breath came in short, rattling gasps. The bandage on his shoulder was dark with fresh blood. No, no, no. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. It was like touching a heated stone. You're burning up. His eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy, unfocused. He looked through her, not at her. Where is she? He muttered, his voice a dry whisper. Who? Clara asked, her own voice shaking. Mother. His hand twitched, reaching for something she could not see. She was standing right there. She was wearing the blue dress. And then he hit her. He hit her, and she fell. Clara's breath caught. She did not understand what he was talking about, but the raw fear in his voice made her chest ache. She set down the lantern, took his hand in both of hers, and squeezed. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe. You're in the barn. No one is going to hurt you here." He did not seem to hear. His head thrashed from side to side, his grip tightening on her hand until it hurt. "I couldn't stop him. I was just a boy. I couldn't stop him." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She did not know what to say. She had no words for a pain so deep it followed a man into his fever dreams. So she did the only thing she knew. She began to sing. It was an old song, one her mother used to hum while hanging laundry on summer mornings. The tune was simple, the words half forgotten, but the melody rose from her throat like a thread of light in the dark barn. "Sleep, my little one, sleep through the night. The moon is your lantern, the stars are your light. No storm can find you, no shadow can stay. For love is the keeper who watches your way." His breathing slowed, the thrashing stopped. His hand still wrapped around hers, relaxed by a fraction. He turned his head toward the sound of her voice, and something in his face softened. The hard lines around his mouth, the furrow between his brows, the clench of his jaw. Then he spoke again, but this time his voice was small, a child's voice, hiding behind a man's cracked lips. "Mama." Clara's heart broke open. She kept singing, her voice wobbling, tears streaming down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall onto the straw, onto his hand, onto the dirty bandage she had wrapped around his shoulder. "I'm here," she whispered between verses. "I'm here." He did not answer, but his grip on her hand loosened and his breathing evened out into the slow rhythm of real sleep. The fever had not broken, but the terror had passed. Clara stayed beside him through the night, her back against the haystack, his hand in hers. The lantern burned low, then went out. The barn grew cold. But she did not leave. She had no bread, no honey, no plan. But she had her voice, and a song her mother had taught her, and a man who had called her Mama in the dark. It was, she decided, enough. Morning came pale and cold. Clara woke with a crick in her neck and a hand that had gone numb. The man was still asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. She pulled her fingers free, gently, careful not to wake him. Her skirt was stiff with dried blood. She stared at the dark stain near the hem, her stomach tightening. There was no way to wash it. The stream was too far, and Hugh would be up soon, checking the henhouse, bunking orders before the sun fully cleared the trees. She tucked the stained fabric under her knees as she walked, hoping the shadows would hide it. The barn door creaked when she pushed it open. The yard was empty. Fog lay low over the ground, muffling every sound. She crossed to the well, pumped a handful of water over her face, and tried to think. She needed bread. She needed honey. She needed a way to hide the blood. She was still standing there, dripping and frozen, when she heard the horses. Hooves, many of them, coming up the road from the south. Clara's breath caught. She turned and ran back to the barn, but she was too slow. The first rider appeared at the edge of the village before she reached the door. A tall man in a dark cloak, his cloak pin shaped like a wolf's head. Behind him, 6 more riders, armed, silent. The village was waking. Doors opened. People stepped out, blinking, clutching their shawls. The tall man pulled his horse to a stop in the center of the square and raised his hand. "I am looking for a wounded man," he said. His voice carried. A tall man, dark hair. He was stabbed 3 days ago near the border. If anyone has seen him, speak now. No one spoke. Clara pressed herself against the barn wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might cheek the boards. The tall man's eyes swept the square. They landed on her. "You, girl." She could not move. Her legs felt like straw. "Come here." She walked. 1 step. 2. Her stained skirt brushed against her ankles. She kept her hands pressed to her sides, hoping to hide the dark patch. The man looked down at her from his horse. His face was hard, clean-shaven, with deep lines around his mouth. He did not smile. "Have you seen a stranger in the past 3 days?" Clara opened her mouth. No sound came out. She thought of the man in the hay, his gray eyes, his rough hand holding hers in the dark, the word he had whispered in his fever. "Mama." "No," she said. Her voice was thin, but it did not break. "I haven't seen anyone." The tall man stared at her. His gaze dropped to her skirt. Time stopped. Clara felt the weight of his stare like a stone on her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to cry. She did neither. Then the tall man's eyes moved past her, scanning the barn roof, the hayloft window, the cracked door. "There's blood on your skirt," he said. Clara looked down. The dark stain was unmistakable in the gray morning light. She had no excuse, no lie prepared. I cut my hand," she said, "on a scythe yesterday." She held up her right hand. There was a small cut on her palm, from the thorn bush she had pushed through 2 days ago. It was not deep, but it was real. The tall man leaned forward in his saddle, studying her. His horse stamped the ground. "Let me see." She held out her hand, palm up. The cut was red and clean. No dirt, no infection. Just a small wound, like 100 other small wounds a village child might carry. The tall man looked at her hand, then at her face, then at the barn again. Clara did not blink. Finally, he straightened. "If you see a wounded man," he said, "you will send word to the castle. There is a reward." She nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. He turned his horse and rode on, his men following. The hoofbeats faded down the road, swallowed by the fog. Clara stood in the square, her hand still outstretched, her palm shaking. She had lied to the Alpha King's men. She had lied, and they had believed her. She turned and walked back to the barn, her legs barely holding her. When she pushed open the door, the man was sitting up in the hay, his eyes open, watching her. "Who was that?" he asked. His voice was hoarse but clear. Clara looked at him, at his fever-flushed face, at the bandage she had wrapped with her own hands. "The king's men," she whispered. "They're looking for you." He said nothing. His jaw tightened. Clara sat down in the hay beside him, her stained skirt pooling around her knees. "Who are you?" she asked. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes. "Someone who should not be found," he said. The next morning came cade and gray. Clara woke in the barn, her back against the wooden wall, a thin blanket pulled over her shoulders. The man was still asleep, his breathing steady but shallow. She had not slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the soldiers. She heard the clink of their armor, the scrape of their swords. She had lied, and she would lie again, if she had to. She crept out of the barn before dawn, her bare feet silent on the frost-hardened ground. The village was still dark. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No voices carried through the morning mist. She went to the kitchen, took a small piece of bread and a handful of dried mint leaves. She wrapped them in her apron and slipped back out. When she returned, the man was awake. He was sitting up, his back against the hay bale, his eyes fixed on the door. "There's a dog outside," he said. "It has been watching the barn all night." Clara's heart jumped. She peered through the crack in the door. The old stray she fed sometimes was sitting in the dirt, its tail wagging slowly. It did not bark, it just sat there, waiting. "He is a friend," Clara said quietly. "He will warn us." The man studied her for a moment. Then he looked away. Clara poured water into a chipped clay cup and held it out to him. He took it. His fingers brushed hers, and she felt the heat of his skin. "Your fever is still high," she said. "It will pass." She did not argue. She just sat down in the hay and unwrapped the bread. She broke it in half and held one piece out to him. He hesitated, then took it. They ate in silence. The morning stretched on. Clara gathered more hay and piled it around him, trying to keep him warm. She brought water from the well, washed her hands, tore strips from her extra petticoat to make fresh bandages. He watched her, saying nothing. At midday, the dog began to growl. Clara froze. She pressed her ear to the crack in the door. Hoofbeats, many of them coming down the road. She turned to the man. His eyes were sharp, his body tensed, ready. "Go to the back," she whispered, "the deepest part of the hay. Do not move." He did not argue. He crawled on his hands and knees into the darkness of the hayloft, dragging his injured leg behind him. Clara covered him with loose straw, layer after layer, until she could no longer see the shape of his body. Then she sat down in front of the pile, picked up a handful of dried mint leaves, and began to sing. It was an old song her mother had taught her, a slow, gentle tune about a river that carried away all sorrows. She sang it softly at first, then louder, her voice steady, filling the barn. She sang as the hoofbeats grew closer. She sang as the horses stopped outside the barn door. She sang as the latch rattled. The door swung open. A soldier stepped in, his armor dull in the dim light. He scanned the barn, his eyes passing over the hay piles, the tools, the empty stalls. Clara kept singing. She did not look at him. The soldier walked past her, his boots crunching on the straw. He stopped near the hayloft, close to where the man was buried. He kicked at a pile of hay with his boot. Clara's voice did not waver. She closed her eyes and sang louder, her hands trembling around the mint leaves. The soldier paused. He looked at her thin shoulders, at her bare, dirty feet. "Girl," he said, "have you seen a wounded man pass through here?" Clara opened her eyes. She looked up at him, her face calm. "No, sir," she said. "Only the old shepherd. He comes through sometimes. He is deaf. He does not speak." The soldier stared at her for a long moment. Then he grunted and turned away. "This place stinks of hay," he muttered. He walked out. The door slammed shut. Clara did not stop singing. She kept her voice steady, the melody rising and falling until the hoofbeats faded into the distance. Then she let the mint leaves fall from her hands. She crawled to the hayloft and began digging with her bare hands, pulling away the straw, revealing his face, his chest, his arms. He was lying still, his eyes closed, his breath held. She touched his cheek. "They are gone," she whispered. He opened his eyes. They were wet. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his gaze holding something she could not name, something raw, something broken. Clara pulled the hay back over him gently. "You can rest now," she said. "I will watch." He closed his eyes, and in the silence of the barn, with the dog finally quiet outside, he let himself sleep. The morning came cold and gray. Clara slipped into the kitchen before dawn, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She reached for the bread shelf. Her hand froze. The loaf was gone. In its place sat a small, familiar clay object. The honey pot. The same one she had left in the hayloft 2 nights ago. It sat dead center on the wooden shelf, scraped clean, like a silent accusation. She stood there, her fingers trembling over the empty pot, the cold seeping through her thin dress. She had been careful. She had only taken half. She had always left a crust behind so the shelf did not look empty. But Hugh had counted. Hugh always counted. The day passed like a wound that would not stop bleeding. Clara mended a torn sack, fetched water from the well, swept the workshop floor. Hugh did not look at her. He did not speak. He only worked. His hammer striking the iron with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. When dusk came, he set down his tools and pointed to the bench. "Sit." She sat. Her hands pressed flat against her thighs, her nails digging into the fabric. He did not shout. That was worse. He spoke slowly, his voice low and tired, like a man who had already made up his mind. "You have been stealing from me." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her tongue heavy. "I did not raise you to be a thief," he said. "I did not raise you at all. I took you in because no one else would. I gave you a roof, a bed, a bowl of stew each night. And this is how you repay me?" "He is hurt," she whispered. "He needs food." Hugh's face did not soften. "Who is he? The stranger in my barn? The one the soldiers are looking for?" She flinched. "You think I do not notice things?" Hugh leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You think I do not hear you singing to the hayloft at night? I am a drunk. Girl, I am not a fool." Silence stretched between them like a rope about to snap. "He leaves tonight," Hugh said, "or I go to the village elder tomorrow and tell him everything." Clara's heart stopped. Then it started again. Faster, harder, pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She said nothing. She rose from the bench and walked out into the cold evening. The barn was dark. The dog lay by the door, its head on its paws, watching her with sad, knowing eyes. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft. Nathaniel was sitting up. His back was against the wall, his legs stretched out before him. He looked stronger. His eyes were clear. He had heard. "I will go," he said before she could speak. She shook her head. "You are not well yet." "I am well enough. The soldiers will not find me." His voice was quiet, final. "I have been hunted before. I know how to disappear." She stood at the edge of the hayloft, her small hands gripping the wooden beam, her knuckles white. She wanted to scream. She wanted to beg. But she had learned long ago that begging did not change anything. He reached for his cloak, the one she had washed and mended. He swung it over his shoulders, wincing as the weight settled on his wound. Then he looked at her. "You have done enough," he said, "more than anyone ever has for me." She did not answer. She just stood there, trembling, her jaw clenched, her eyes burning. He climbed down the ladder. The dog stood up, wagging its tail uncertainly. He reached the barn door. He paused. And then he heard it. A sound so small, so broken, it stopped him in his tracks. She was not screaming. She was not crying loudly. She was just standing in the hayloft, her face buried in her hands and weeping. The kind of weeping that comes from a place so deep it has no words. He turned back. He looked up at her, his dark eyes catching the last sliver of moonlight through the crack in the wall. "Clara." She did not lift her face. "Clara," he said again, softer. "I have nothing to give you. No home, no safety, no promise that I will not bring more danger to your door." She lowered her hands. Her cheeks were wet, her nose red, her hair tangled with straw. You are not better yet," she said, her voice cracking. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised them both. He walked back to the ladder and climbed up. Not to leave, to sit beside her, to sit in the hay, next to the trembling girl who had fed him with her own hands, who had lied for him, who had signed to keep them alive. He did not touch her. He just sat beside her, his shoulder a hand's width from hers. "I will stay tonight," he said quietly. "But tomorrow, you must let me go." She nodded. She did not look at him. But she did not move away either. And in the darkness of the hayloft, with the dog settling back down by the door, they sat together, the king and the orphan, two broken people holding the silence between them like a fragile, sacred thing. The morning came cold and gray, with mist clinging to the ground like a ghost. Clara woke in the hayloft, stiff and aching. The space beside her was empty. For one terrible moment, she thought he had left without saying goodbye. Then she heard voices outside. Men's voices. Low and urgent. She scrambled to the loft edge and peered through a crack in the boards. Her heart stopped. 5 men on horseback stood in the yard. Their cloaks were dark, their horses stamped the frozen ground. And at their head, a man in a deep blue tunic with a silver wolf embroidered on the chest. He was older than the others, with a gray streaked beard and eyes that swept the village like a hawk scanning for prey. Nathaniel was standing in the barn doorway facing them. He was no longer wearing the torn hunting coat. Someone had given him a cloak, clean, dark, lined with fur. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. He looked like a different man. No, Clara thought. He looks like who he truly is. The gray-bearded man dismounted and dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice thick with relief. "We have searched for you for 7 days." Clara's breath stopped. "Your Majesty." The word hung in the cold air like a bell note, long and terrible and true. She slid down the ladder without thinking, her bare feet hitting the dirt floor. She walked to the barn doorway. She did not hide. She did not run. The gray-bearded man looked up. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, a thin, dirty girl in a torn dress, standing barefoot in the morning frost. "Who is this?" he asked. Nathaniel turned. When his eyes found Clara, something in his face changed. The mask of the king slipped, and for a moment, he was just the man in the hayloft again, the one who had let her feed him honey, the one who had held her hand in the dark. He walked toward her. The guards tensed. The gray-bearded man rose to his feet. But Nathaniel did not stop until he stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the stubble on his jaw, the tied shottle under his eyes. "Clara," he said. His voice was low, gentle. "I did not want you to find out this way." She could not speak. Her throat was closed, her hands shaking at her sides. You are the king?" she whispered. He nodded. "The Alpha King." She stepped back, her eyes filled with tears. "I lied to the soldiers," she said, her voice breaking. "I lied to Hugh. I stole bread and honey and bandages. I hid you like a secret. And you are the king." She pressed her hand over her mouth. "Will they punish me?" The gray-bearded man took a step forward. "Your Majesty, this child has seen your face. She knows your location. The law requires." Nathaniel raised one hand. The man fell silent. Then the Alpha King of Thornwood, the Iron Wolf, the man whose name made armies tremble, lowered himself to his knees in the dirt of the barnyard. He looked up at her, eye to eye. "Clara," he said, "you are not in trouble. You saved my life. You fed me when I could not feed myself. You sang to me when I was afraid. You held my hand when I cried for a mother I lost, 30 years ago." His voice cracked, just a little. "I have never told anyone about that night. Not a single soul. But I am telling you now. Because you deserve to know the truth." He took a breath. "My mother was killed by my father when I was 13. He hid her in front of me, and she never got up. I learned that day that showing weakness meant dying. So I stopped. I stopped feeling. I stopped trusting. I became the king everyone expected me to be, cold, hard, untouchable." His eyes glistened. "And then a 12-year-old girl with chapped hands and a broken dress fed me half her bread and sang me a lullaby." Clara was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks. You still hurt," she said, inside. He did not deny it. "Yes," he said quietly. "But you taught me that hurt does not have to be hidden alone." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, crumpled bundle. "The dried mint leaves you dropped in the haystack that night." He had kept them. "I am not good at saying things," he said, "but I am learning." He stood up slowly, his knees creaking. He looked down at her with an expression she had never seen on any adult's face before. Not pity, not command, but something soft and unguarded. "You are braver than any soldier in my army," he said, "and if you will let me, I would like to repay that bravery. Not with gold, not with titles. With a promise." He held out his hand. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you send word to the capital, and I will come. Clara looked at his hand, large, scarred, the hand of a warrior. She thought of the night she had held in a hayloft when he was burning with fever and calling for a mother who had been dead for 30 years. She took his hand. Will you write to me?" she asked, her voice small. He smiled, that crooked, unused smile she had seen only once before. "I will learn how," he said. The letter arrived on a gray morning in late autumn, carried by a rider in a plain cloak. Hugh brought it to the barn where Clara was mending a torn sack. He held it out without a word, his face unreadable. Clara stared at the folded parchment. She had never received a letter before. The seal was pressed with dark wax, a wolf's head, simple and clear. "It's from the capital," Hugh said, his voice gruff. "The rider said it's for you." Clara took the letter with trembling hands. She did not know how to read. She had never been taught. Hugh sighed, then sat down on an overturned bucket. "Give it here." He read it aloud, slowly, as if tasting each word. "Dear Clara, I have returned to the capital. The healer says I will keep the scar on my ribs, but I will keep something else as well. The memory of a girl who fed me black bread and honey when I had nothing. I have ordered the old orphanage rebuilt. It will have a proper roof and a hearth that does not smoke. I have hired a teacher for the children who live there. If you wish, there is a place for you. The teacher's name is Margaret. She is kind. She knows how to read and write, and she knows how to listen. I think you would like her. I am learning to smile. It is still difficult, but I try. Every morning, in front of the mirror, the servants probably think I have gone mad. I have kept the dried mint leaves you left in the hayloft. Come to the capital, Clara, not because I am a king, but because I want to be your friend. Yours, Nathaniel. P.S. The dog is also welcome. I have a large kitchen garden. The winter passed. In the spring, a small cart left the village at dawn. Clara sat in the back, holding a cloth bundle with her few belongings. Beside her, the dog rested its head on her knee. The road to the capital stretched long and winding through the greening hills. Clara did not know what waited for her at the end of it. A new home, a schoolroom, a king who was still learning to smile. But she knew one thing. She was not alone anymore. And that, she thought, was enough. It seems a brave heart can heal even an alpha king. Tell me, fellow romantics, where are you listening from tonight? And do you think Nathaniel will finally learn to smile for Clara? Leave your city and thoughts below and subscribe to stay with us. Until our next tale, keep the embers glowing.